Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me for this segment, we have Frederick, Managing Director of Trading and Derivatives at the Schwab Center for Financial Research, to discuss the August reading for the Investor Movement Index. The IMX is TD Ameritrade's proprietary behavior-based index aggregating Main Street investor positions and activity to measure what investors actually were doing and how they were positioned in the markets. Randy, it's great to see you as always. Welcome back to Trade Talks. And it appears that while August was a bit volatile, they did dial up some exposure here.
Yeah, you're right. So the MOVE index moved up from 468 to 482. And what's interesting about that is it's actually the first uptick we've seen since late last year. And that's pretty fascinating because, as you know, for the first 6 months of this year, the market went lower, but it bottomed out in mid-June and started to rebound. And I think what this tells me is that investors are actually seeing a little bit of confidence for the first time in about 7 months that the rebound off the mid-June lows may have some legs. Now, I realize in the last couple of weeks we've had a little bit of a downtick, so it'll be interesting to see how it comes out this month. It's a little too soon to know for sure, but it does tell us that investors, I think, are doing what we've been telling them to do, which is to take a little bit of a long-term focus, look for some good bargains out there, and that I think the index reflects that.
Yeah, and Randy, it was interesting because the buys were really a mixed bag of different sectors and different types of companies, ranging from Amazon to AT&T.
Yeah, when you look at it from the perspective of individual names, yes, there were some tech stocks in the buy group and in the sell group. There were some industrials, there were communications, there were retail. So there were different, on an individual stock basis, it was a very mixed bag. If you look at it on a sector perspective, however, it's a lot more interesting. There are only 2 sectors year to date that are net positive. I think everyone knows energy, especially, up very sharply, about 43% year to date, whereas utilities are only up about 4%. But out of the 11 sectors, those are the only 2 that are positive. And here's where the index gets interesting. Those are the only 2 sectors that investors did not buy. And what that tells me is that people are looking for bargains. They're doing what you're supposed to do, which is buy low, sell high. The ones that have been high flyers that have outperformed so far are getting a little bit expensive, especially if you look at them from a valuation perspective. So they've stayed away from those. But the ones that have been beaten down a little bit, because everyone knows that sectors rotate, and over the course of several months, those at the bottom tend to move to the top, and those at the top tend to move to the bottom. When we see people buying the stuff that's been beaten down, not on an individual name perspective, but if you're looking at it from the perspective of a sector, it makes a lot of sense, especially if you have a long-term perspective, to start looking at the ones that have been underperformers year to date. Then when those start to move up towards the top, you'll be happy you bought when they were on sale.
Yeah, for sure. And Randy, I also thought it was interesting that both TD Ameritrade millennial clients and the overall client population really favored the same stocks. Again, Amazon being the one that they really gravitated to.
Yeah, well, I mean, Amazon's obviously a behemoth, and certainly not just the retail sector, but it's one of those names like Apple, like Microsoft, like Google, that tends to be, sort of a bellwether for the market in general, not necessarily just the consumer discretionary, which is the sector that Amazon is in, but even the technology sector, which a lot of people think of Amazon as being a tech stock, but technically it's actually in consumer discretionary. But it's such a big name and has such a big balance sheet that when you see companies like an Apple, like an Amazon move in certain ways, it can have an influence on the entire market.
And finally, Randy, let's get some of your outlook here as we go into September, which is historically the most volatile month of the year. And of course, October has some fireworks as well. What's really on your radar? What's going to move the needle here? Because we really don't have any earnings this month either.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, there's obviously always a few companies that aren't on a normal earnings cycle that will trickle in throughout the periods of time in between earnings season. But as you said, we just finished up the last earnings season. We got probably about a 4-week gap here before the next earnings season begins. So it's a bit of a quiet time. What happens then, of course, is people tend to focus on other things that are going on. And clearly the biggest issue by far, without a doubt, is what's going on with the Fed, the interest rate tightening cycle, and how it relates to inflation. We know that on September 21st, we're going to get another interest rate hike. That's a certainty. The only question is, will it be 0.5% or 0.75%? And right now, that's about of a toss-up. Just a week ago or so, we were leaning towards a little bit more towards the 0.5% side. This week, it's leaning a little bit more towards the 0.75% side. My belief is markets are going to continue to be volatile. We're going to see not only big up and down days, but big days where it moves in both directions. We've had several of those recently, at least until September 21st, and perhaps even beyond that until the next hike, which is on November 2nd. I think we could be in for some volatile times all the way until about the beginning of November.
All right, Randy, I appreciate the insight as always. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.
You're very welcome.